This evening on The Rock Newman Show, the Black Seminoles of Florida participated in one of the most successful slave revolts in U.S. history. Historian Dr. Anthony Dixon has studied this group of Native Americans and blacks and joins us to share their struggles and determination and how they resisted the efforts of the U.S. military to keep them enslaved. Coming up right now on The Rock Newman Show. Welcome to the Rock Newman Show from the campus of historic Howard University. I'm Rock Newman, and it is my desire to inspire you with personal stories of extraordinary achievement. In the early 1950s, Hollywood films not only depicted Native Americans as savages, but the roles were often played by white actors. Let's take a look.
I bring him a most important message.
I do not trust you. Silence your tongue, young one. He has been in council with his chiefs. Come. We will find him.
My guest is an African-American history professor with expert knowledge about the efforts to enslave the entire Black Seminole population in Florida and the Second Seminole War. Joining me now is author and historian, Dr. Anthony Dixon. Welcome to the Rock Newman Show.
Good afternoon, brother. Thank you for having me.
Let me say from the outset that your book here called Florida's Negro War is one I really wish we had several hours to examine this evening. The Seminole Wars are little known history facts, much mischaracterized when it has been talked about, and I want to get into all of that. Before I do, though, I want to get a little introduce my audience to you, Dr. Anthony Dixon. We were talking last night, and you said something that you would have no idea how much it resonated with me because you mentioned one of my favorite characters in all of American history, and that is Jackie Robinson. Okay. And then you mentioned another one named Mary McLeod Bethune.
Yeah. So
if you wouldn't mind, as we start this here, if you would share how their paths crossed in the great state of Florida.
Okay. Well, of course, Mary McLeod came into Florida in the early 1900s, and she established a school for African-American girls, and it went on to become what we call now Bethune-Cookman University. The relationship between the two was such. Of course, Jackie Robinson played baseball for the Dodgers. Their spring training was in Daytona. Mm-hmm. However, Jackie could not stay in Daytona. There wasn't a rooming house. There wasn't a hotel that would accept him. So he would initially he started spending his time in a nearby city called Sanford. If you recall, this is where Trayvon Martin was murdered. Right. And he would have to ride over from Sanford into Daytona for practice. Mm-hmm. But in time, he developed a relationship with Mary McLeod. And so he began to spend more time on campus at Bethune-Cookman, and he was welcomed there. So he didn't have to drive all the way back to Sanford every day, especially after a long day of practice. Mm-hmm. He was allowed to come over to Bethune-Cookman, and he began to spend a lot more time with Mary McLeod. By this time, she was toward the end of her career and life, for that matter. But they still developed a very good relationship, and we do have archival material to attest to that relationship.
Yeah, and where he would come visit her at the house
Yes.
is a home that she worked from and created a small museum of sorts initially in a room?
No, what she did was she created a foundation. She created a foundation at her home. She added a room to it as an office.
Yeah.
And through that, she began to continue her work for the African American community. And when I say African American community, I mean as a whole, with the National Council of Negro Women,
Yes.
her work with the Black Cabinet,
Yeah.
Subsequent work years later through those relationships. All of those things she culminated into a foundation.
Right.
And so the home itself has now become a museum. So the foundation is still there. NCNW still comes on campus.
Yeah.
We still do carry on some of her work, some of the community work that she started. But we also now interpret her life through the house and through the museum. And so now her house is a museum itself.
And who's the executive director?
I am.
It's good to have the executive director of the Mary McLeod Bethune House and Museum.
Yes.
Yeah.
That as well as the archives that is located right next door in the library.
Right.
And
right.
so we have the University Archives that has the complete Mary McLeod Bethune collection, which includes her work here in D.C.
Have you been to, by any chance, the National Council of Negro Women building here, offices here in Washington, D.C.?
No, I have
Man,
not.
it's it was the first owned property by African Americans right downtown here on Pennsylvania Avenue.
Oh, no,
Yeah,
that I did not know.
One of our giants, Dorothy Height, headed up the National Council of Negro Women for many years, and obviously was worshipped Mary McLeod Bethune and carried on in a great tradition. And she put it all together, man. She and her team to get that building down there.
Yes, she did a great job, and she was also very close to Mary as well.
Yeah.
She was a regular guest on campus as well. As a few other activists and other people, known people, African American, that we give notoriety to.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, not all relationships were glitz and glamour and gold.
Sure.
Relationship come to mind quickly. Zora Neale. Zora Neale Hurston
Yes.
actually taught at Bethune-Cookman for a short stint. But we find that relationship, two bright stars don't always shine together.
Yeah.
So her stint at Bethune-Cookman was short, but nevertheless, it was impactful.
Yeah. So let me ask you, you wrote this book, Florida's Negro War, Black Seminoles and the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842. Give us a little bit about your background, and please tell us how you became interested in publishing this book.
First, even in undergrad, history was my major. Afro-Am studies was my minor. And I had the honor of working under Dr. Larry Rivers, who actually wrote the anthology piece on slavery in Florida. And so when I returned to Florida A&M from my undergrad, after receiving it, I returned for my master's. I became his graduate assistant. And in that, he was always sending me to the library, sending me to the state archives, different places. And so for me, I became interested. My area was slavery and Reconstruction.
Just to clear, Dr. Larry Rivers was president of Fort Valley State?
Yes. The same
Okay.
Dr. He left from Florida A&M and went on to become president of Fort Valley State.
Right.
Now, in that, my studies for and looking at slavery and Reconstruction, I started then kind of narrowing the focus, and I started looking at resistance and resistance to slavery and oppression. And so in doing so, I came across this very unique, outstanding story of African Americans who actually resisted slavery. They resisted their re-enslavement. They resisted the enslavement of their offspring, of their children and their descendants, and they ended up going into a war, partnering with the Seminole Native Americans and going into a war that we now consider the longest and deadliest Native American war fought on U.S. soil. But we are also now looking at it and examining it as possibly, and what I like to call, the largest slave rebellion on U.S. soil. We talk about the Point Coupé, we talk about Nat Turner, and of course we talk about Denmark and
Denmark Vesey.
the failed Denmark Vesey and the failed attempt. But we don't talk about this group of people who actually absconded, got their freedom, retained their freedom, fought the U.S. government for 7 long years, and were able to keep their freedom. And so when we look at it in that vernacular and we start looking at the dynamics from that perspective, we have to start looking at the Second Seminole War as a slave rebellion.
Yeah.
And furthermore, not only if we look at it as a slave rebellion, we now have to say that it is the largest on U.S. soil.
Yeah. And, you know, on the clip that was played, when I first saw it, it just made my head explode because the title, Seminole War Cries, and it said, thunder and fury of savage vengeance. So the depiction back in the 1950s, up until that time and since that time, has so often been just of that when, which speaks to the issue that until the lion is able to write his story, the one doing the capturing is always going to be glorified. And that was just so prominent when you see these kinds of films about this war and about this time. In your book, one of the first things that caught me was you write black maroon settlements in the wilderness existed by utilizing a Pan-Africanist perspective in the social, political, religious, and military organization of their communities. And you say that, why?
Given their roots themselves initially, most of your initial Florida Maroons are actually abscond runaways.
I was going to ask you to describe Maroons.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maroons are basically enslaved people who decide to run away, to abscond from the plantation and eke out the existence in the wilderness however they can.
Yeah.
And so they go into the most, what we would call treacherous portions, especially for Europeans. And when I say that, I mean particularly the swampy areas, because the swamps and water, of course, bring the mosquitoes, and the mosquitoes would bring yellow fever. And Europeans and their descendants were highly susceptible to yellow fever. So they would specifically go, like the Great Dismal Swamp on the North Carolina, Virginia area, and then into Florida, in the different areas in Florida, for those specific reasons that they could eke out their own existence. Now, where these people come from are primarily out of the Georgia and South Carolina Sea Islands, and what we call Gullah, and which is now, of course, the only national heritage area dedicated to African American culture, and we call it the Gullah Heritage Corridor, Gullah Geechee National Heritage Corridor. Now, these people, your Gullah people, are basically people who take West African languages, because it's now a homogenized group of West Africans now, and so they create a language that we call Geechee, and they incorporate West African culture, West African language, and then they incorporate plantation life, specifically English plantation life, and of course English words. And so they created their own culture. We call it Gullah, we call their language Geechee. Now, when these people began to run away, they began to head south. I know most people think the Underground Railroad always went north,
Right.
but the first Underground Railroad actually went south into, at that time, La Florida. And the Spanish held Florida, and they called it La Florida at this time.
Right.
And so because they are arguing, and when I say they, I mean the English and the Spanish, they are fighting for control over parts of the East Coast. They are actually fighting for
English,
all of
English
the,
and British.
The English and the Spanish. They're fighting.
But I meant to say the Spanish and the British.
Right. The Spanish and the British are fighting for control over the East Coast, basically.
Right.
The Spanish have laid claim from as far as Miami all the way up to Newfoundland, Canada. And of course, the English are disputing that. And so what happens is the Spanish understand that the English survival is based on plantation society, that they have placed it on how well they are going to do in terms of the agriculture. Whereas the Spanish are looking at the precious commodities. They find the gold and the silver, of course, out west. And so they're more concerned out west than they are with the East Coast. But when the British come and start taking and engulfing the land and claiming it as their own, they have to come back and focus. And so when they focus, they realize that how the English goes is how their slaves go, how the enslaved, how many they bring in, how much work they get done, and that is clearly the point of which they are going to build plantation society. So what the Spanish do to counter that is that they offer, in 1693, they offer an edict that says any enslaved person that runs away from the English society can come to La Florida and live for free. Now, what happens is
Live in freedom.
Live in freedom, live for free. Now, we have two different scenarios there. They say you can go two ways. You can either go into the wilderness, live in Florida, in the wilderness, eke out your own existence. We only ask that when you see the British, if you see them in the area, get word to us. That's all that we ask. And then there was a second offering, or second group. They made an offer. Well, a second group arises out of an offer, and they basically say you can live under Spanish authority.
You can.
You can. You can come to St. Augustine, Florida, and live under Spanish authority. They built a fort. It's called Fort Mose. It is now a historical site. And the thing about it is, of course, because it's Spanish and you're going under the authority, they had one main rule is that they had to become Catholic. Right. So we see cultural differences starting.
Catholicism.
Starting to come about between the two groups of runaways. Now, those that are living in the wilderness, though, they are eking out their own existence, and they are retaining Gullah culture, and they are keeping that Gullah culture. And so we see Gullah at this point, once it gets into Florida, and it goes from Florida to the Bahamas, and to Texas, to Oklahoma, and ultimately to Nacimiento, Mexico. There's a small group of Gullah people that actually do leave Fort Mose, and they end up in Cuba, and they have a community there as well. And so what we see is Gullah then turning into a diaspora once it comes into Florida. And so what then happens also is, while they are creating these small villages and eking out this society, there are also Native Americans that are trying to escape plantation society as well, out of the same area. We see the larger numbers, of course, coming after the Yamasee War.
Now, if I could stop you for a second, because you say, the Native Americans are trying to escape plantation existence also.
Right.
Because what has happened is they who originally occupied the land now was having their land taken away from them.
Yeah.
And then captured by those who took the land.
Right. And it's also more than that as well. I know that's the most important thing, that taking your land and taking parts of your freedom, but also it's the encroachment of the society. You see, the basic problem, and I won't go too far on tangent there, but the basic problem between Europeans and Native Americans was property use and land right. That was the basic problem. They had two very different concepts.
Right.
Native Americans did not believe that you could own the land.
Right.
Whereas, of course, Europeans, you own what you can get or take.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And so under those basic ideologies, the conflict in those basic ideologies, we see everything else stemming from when terms of that relationship.
Right.
Now, when we look at relationship between Native Americans and blacks or Africans at this time, it has to develop because initially all Native Americans see are these black people on their land, clearing their land.
Yeah.
And so they had to come to the understanding that these black people, these Africans, were being forced to do so. And it wasn't these Africans that were actually encroaching your land. It's actually the people who were driving the force and were manipulating and quote unquote owning them. And so
let me stop you there, because I want to give the viewers an opportunity to see how you succinctly put this. As we talked about the definition of maroon. She said these maroon communities established close relationships with the neighboring Native Americans. These two communities lived for the most part in harmony and provided the foundation for what would later become the Seminole Nation. I want to go further. The culture was created by fusing various African traditions, which resulted in Pan-Africanist ethos within the community. This type of Pan-African culture existed with minimal European interference. These Pan-Africanist cultural traits manifested themselves in a variety of cultural forms that distinguished their communities from both Spanish society and Native American communities, regardless of the close proximity. Research has shown that these cultural traits were most prevalent in communication, artistic expression, and religion.
yes, and each one communication with the Gullah, what they did, and this is where we really start seeing Gullah turn into a diaspora, because they are cohabitating and nothing happens overnight, right? They're coming down through what was considered the buffer zone then, and of course it ends up becoming the last 13 colony, becoming Georgia.
Yeah.
And so in that buffer zone, we start seeing a lot of Native Americans and particularly the smaller bands of Native Americans, not the large ones, the Creeks, the Cherokee, but initially the smaller ones, the Hittites and the Uchis, the smaller bands, and those that are smaller factions out of the Yamasee, or Yamasee, some say. What's happening is they begin to cohabitate a little bit, but moreover, they're beginning to find ways to communicate better with each other. So what we see is now the Gullah dialect, Gullah language starting to incorporate Native American words. And so once that happens, we see a metamorphosis, and we don't call that Gullah. We actually call that the Afro-Seminole Creole language.
Okay.
And so that is the mixture between Gullah, which again is the West African and English words, and now we have certain Native American words that are put into it, and that is what changes it, and that's what really puts us on that road to saying Gullah is a diaspora. So now in that, right, back to the relationship itself, this cohabitation continues to grow.
Yes.
Because Plantation Society is encroaching upon Native Americans, and it's encroaching in that they're chasing away the food, which means they're changing their way of life. And so they are also having to depend on these runaways as well to show them how to actually plant different crops, how to rotate different crops in order for sustainability now.
Right.
Because they can't rely on the hunting that they have done for eons of years prior.
And let me interject, please, because when you say plantation life, I want my viewers to make sure they understand what that is. That plantation life is about enslaving people to be able to grow the plantations.
Right, but it's also turning, for Native Americans, is turning the land into an agrarian society.
Yeah.
See, all those open fields where the deer ran and the bears went, where they could have plenty of food, rabbits and all of that, are now being chased out because you have enslaved people who are now turning over the ground, turning it all into fields. And so that is also the encroachment, that they are losing their food supply as well.
Right.
And so they are being forced out of the area. They're being forced out of the area as well as Plantation Society grows. So they began to cohabitate. Now, I have to tell you this, and this is important, and it kind of leads back to why you also get some of these negative words. We've always had those general savage terms for Native Americans, but the ironic thing about this particular case, and the ironic thing about the Seminoles, is the Seminoles are a homogeneous group of Native Americans themselves. They are actually, the majority of them are former Creeks. What happens is there's a large schism in the Creek Nation. The Creek Nation breaks. You have your upper Creeks that live in northern part of present-day Alabama. They're up, of course, by the mountains up in that area. And then you have your lower Creeks that are down in that corner between Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, right? And so what happens is the ones in the South, they began to accept Plantation Society. They even began to buy and trade enslaved people. And so they began to not resist plantation, but actually join and work with Plantation Society. And so the Creeks up north were basically, what are you doing? We don't own people. We take them as war. We hold them so we won't have to fight them again. We keep their women so we can keep our numbers up. But we don't enslave them for our own living. You know, what are you all doing? And so there's this schism. And so the northern Creeks push their way through Alabama. They push through the southern Creeks and they come into Florida. And so when they come into Florida, they mix with the other Native Americans that are also running. You have the Miccosukee, like I said, you have the other smaller bands. You even have some Cherokee that are leaving North Georgia and the other areas of Georgia, and they're coming down into Florida. These are smaller bands, though, that are kind of broken away because they needed to figure out how they were going to survive as well. And so they become this homogeneous group that we call the Seminoles. And it actually, when you look at the word and you trace it back, Semolina, Cimarron, it has different meanings, but the main one is Breakaway Creek or Renegade Creek. That's why everything you see with Florida State University and they say the Seminoles, the first thing you see up on it is Renegade, because that is one of the original terms for Semolina. And then there was a negative term that the Spanish gave, Cimarron, which basically meant wild beast, wild dog. And of course you can understand that it's just like anything else. When you're on the opposite side of the team, you know, you the opponent, it's not going to be a positive word. On the other side, even when we use the word griot, most people don't know, for Europeans, they thought the word griot was a very negative word. It was a negative term, but we embrace that term. And so it's the same thing here. When we look at the words like savage and all of that good stuff, it's that opposite side of the fence type of thing.
When part of, just as you're describing here, and we haven't gotten, you know, into the book yet, where you really start to talk about what is the violence, the continual grabbing of the land, the slaughter of the people, and to deal with the book, you know, we will get there. But, you know, just early on, I made a big note when you talked about Angola being the first noted town there of the Native American settlements, Angola. And then you go, then on the same page is in 1821, Angola was destroyed and the town burned. And in terms of the U.S. military, and again, its occupation, just throughout history, when either Native Americans have been involved or African Americans have been involved, there is the burning of a town, man. There's the slaughter of a people. And so on page 11, I just felt, you know, without dramatizing it, you expose the terror. When one thinks for a second that here are people who live every waking hour, who one have been imported as slaves, others who were the original inhabitants of the land, and every waking hour they must be mindful of the tyranny that is coming at them with fire and fury that they have no experience with for a very long time.
I'm gonna start, let me jump in there first, the point of clarification. Angola was actually a Black Seminole village. It sat next to it. Native Americans lived outside of Angola. And you are right, you see that time and time again, even in this period with my book and dealing with the Black Seminoles. There are actually two other instances where villages are being burned, that they can just completely burn it down. And so we see that as a regular tactic, you know, that is a regular tactic that was used all the way up through the we can trace that all the way through all the way to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and other places. That this is when communities, when African American communities are out of the graces, so to speak, of the larger white community, they simply get rid of it. And they do it normally by just destroying the whole thing. And we all know fire is a pretty good tool, and it's pretty quick and easy.
So, you know, I don't want to jump around too much, but I want to do this because as I was reading it, I wrote in big letters the legitimacy of the conversation of reparations. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation. That's a whole nother show. But when you just go back and look at the basics here of what people had and the slaughter that took place and the stealing by force of land, by murder and slaughter and genocide, that issue of reparations, just I couldn't get past. What am I on? Page 18. It's like, man, does this ever make a case without trying to do it for reparations?
And I'll say this briefly so we can stay on topic about reparations. We have different instances. This is clearly a case. We have another case I'll mention in just a second. The issue is there's always been opposition, right? And that opposition to it comes in this idea of quantifiable measurement, right? How can we quantify things if we really want to say reparations, right? And that's been the biggest tool against reparations, right? But the thing about it is we actually can. There are instances where we can quantify. One in particular I always use, think about all of those years African Americans went paying taxes to state schools that they couldn't go to. You see, so there are things that are quantifiable when we can look at when talking about reparations. So this whole notion about it not being able to be done because we can never quantify, that's a farce. That's just something to hold us off like everything else.
You're right. That is another conversation.
Yeah,
You know,
that's
so I I make notes here. I said, the desire to be free, and the fear of enslavement that is going on, and I just underlined something. It says runaway slave. Again, as we lead into how the free blacks, the runaway slaves, and the Native Americans, the natives, how they which became Seminoles and then came to the Seminole War, just leading up to that, again, is this idea of folks living and being all the time in terror. They're all the time living with the sense of terror that is just around the corner, because these folks who get depicted in these movies, what they are, calling themselves United States military, calling themselves Plantation Society, or the rest, are terrorists.
Or the militia.
Or the militia are terrorists.
Yes.
Terrorizing the population.
And you have to understand that it's a progression as well.
Yes.
It's a progression. That's why we ended up in 3 Seminole Wars, because each time, if we can actually see how each Seminole War directly affected the growth of Florida, and Florida becoming what it is today. The first Seminole War opened up Plantation Society for Florida.
Opened up Plantation Society.
Yes.
Opened up where landowners came in and built wealth off the back of slaves.
And taking the land from the Native Americans.
And taking the land, yes.
To do so.
Right.
And so what we see with that first war is, with the first Seminole War, they get to clear out the Native Americans out of North Florida, particularly the area from Tallahassee to Gainesville, because that land was considered as fertile, and in some places more fertile than even Georgia. And at this time, Georgia was becoming cotton king. And so the expansion into Florida, they figured, had to be done. And so when they removed them, we see Plantation Society coming in, but also this is when Florida becomes a territory. Florida becomes a territory just after the first Seminole War.
And you're right. And once Florida became a United States possession in 1821, whites were infuriated by black-Indian relationship. Thus, from 1821 to 1835, relations between Seminoles and whites steadily deteriorated. So, how dare you, inferior people, have a civil relationship?
And not only that, continue to work together against us.
Yeah.
See, that's the thing. But they gave them that common, the enemy of my enemy.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
And so what we see is that first war, right, clearing out the land, Florida becoming a territory. The second one, the one that the book is based on, that ends up being a 7-year war. Now, here's the issue with that. We have Native Americans who are agreeing to leave. Then we have Native Americans who said we're not going to leave.
Right.
And one in particular is Osceola. He's not a chief, but because of his war attributes, he becomes a war chief. And so you have those who are willing to stay, who want to stay and don't want to leave. But at the same token, you have your Black Seminoles, right?
Right.
And at this point, we stop calling them Maroons and we call them Seminoles, because they now make a concerted effort to not only live together. We have familial relationships now. It usually happens at the top, but they're still doing it. They're cohabitating together. All of those good things. Right?
Marrying.
Yes, intermarriage. It's usually done at the higher level, but
Sure.
Between chiefs and whatnot, but it's being done. And so at that point, right, you got 2 different things that are going on, right? You got the Native Americans who want to keep the land. You got the blacks who want to keep their freedom, right? And so when they go into this war in 1835, is because they are fueled, of course, by the Indian removal policy from Andrew Jackson, who got his political career in Florida as well. And this is where he actually got the concept to develop the Indian removal policy.
Yes.
By helping Florida get rid of the Seminoles the first round in North Florida. Now, once this happens, the war becomes evident that it is not about removing Native Americans, but it is more so about getting these blacks back into slavery.
Profoundly so.
Not only for the work,
Yeah.
because there is a number that could change things in terms of work. There's a large enough workforce there that could be garnered, right? But not only that, not only the workforce, it is the concept, right? It's the idea that you have an area that is growing into a colony that could be go from a settlement to a colony that could go to its own nation based on the fact of the opposition of slavery. Meaning our slaves, as plantation, our enslaved people, right, will get the notion to go to Florida because there is a black nation there. And so what happens, what we find is at the end of the First Seminole War and before the second, right, toward the end of the first, well, actually the first Seminole, excuse me, let me get it straight because we want to get the timeline right. There is a fort, and it's called Negro Fort. It was left by the British to these blacks. And for this period of time, that is a progression to a nation. You start out as a settlement, then you go to a colony, the colony gets a fort, then it grows and it develops, and next thing you know, you can get, your colony can develop into whatever else you want. If you want it to be its own country, you want it to be its own nation, you could. And so that was by far the worst idea. That was the worst.
The most troubling.
Well, that was, right, that was the most troubling. That was the worst, that was the worst scenario. Let's say that, that'd be better to say. That was the worst scenario for Plantation Society. To have these, because they figured as long as they were down here in Florida living free, then they would always have to watch theirs, and they would just continuously run. And then Plantation Society would start to demise. And some even express the ending of Plantation Society if this continues to go on in Florida, that this would end Plantation Society.
And so something I wanted to examine here, because now you're saying, you know, we're into the first war, there's a contemplation of the second, but in the meantime, there had been some agreements. There had been, for those who agreed to move out, there had been treaties.
Right. Two main treaties.
There had been agreements. And how did those who were the oppressor handle those treaties?
Well, they were lopsided. Let's just call it like it is. They were lopsided treaties. The first one that got the Seminoles removed out of North Florida, pushed them down into Central Florida, around the area between present-day Orlando and Tampa. And when they got down there, many of them didn't like the land. There's a lot of lakes in that area, swampy. Native Americans didn't care for that.
Again, in terms of logistics here, they were occupying the most fertile land, where they had coastlines, where they were able to do trade.
The coastline and that land just below Georgia, where basically cotton is becoming king. Where that fertile land that was making cotton become king in Georgia, some of that land extended itself into North Florida. And so they just really were concerned about the northern portion, where that land was the best.
And so where the natives were occupying.
It was Seminole land.
And so therefore you got to go off there and go over to some land that's not nearly as fertile, not nearly as productive.
Nowhere near. And so some took the agreement. They took the buyout, they took the payment, all of that good stuff. Went down into the area went down into the area, and then realized how bad the land was, how rough it would be to start over down there. And so many of them started returning. They came back saying, no, we're not going for that.
Yeah.
You all, you pulled a flim-flam with that.
Yeah.
We're not going for it.
Yeah.
And so then we see other negotiations coming, right? And so the Indian removal policy is starting to take place nationally, and Jackson is coming into office, he becomes president, so this Indian removal policy is going nationwide. And so then the offer then came to actually go out west.
Yeah.
And see, that's because that's what they would do. They would take Native Americans who were out west and they bring them to the East Coast. This is how Geronimo ends up in Florida. They bring Geronimo to Florida and they take Osceola and take him out west to present-day Oklahoma, which back then we called the Arkansas Territory.
Right.
And so when this happens, right, when they start coming back, they say, no, this is not going to happen. Then they show them the land out west, right? Again, Native Americans are split. Some Native Americans say, take the buyout because they're going to kill us all. Do we really want to be the ones responsible for, ending our existence?
Yeah.
And then you have the blacks, right? The blacks see that land as an opportunity. When they go out to the Arkansas Territory and they're, the Black Seminole leadership goes out there with the Native American leadership and they look at that land, they see it as an opportunity. The problem is the government didn't have that land in mind for them. It was just for the Native Americans. They had planned to round up all of the Black Seminoles and return them
To slavery.
to slavery.
Yeah.
And so once this was evidently clear, right, that is what brought the unifying effect in again. So even those who were willing to go said, oh no, we're not going without them.
Yeah.
Because some of them were their children. Some of them were their wives, their husbands, grandchildren.
Yeah.
So they were like, no, we're not going out there without them. And so what happens is negotiations start falling apart, and we end up in that second war.
Okay, and I'm glad you say there, you bring it to negotiations fall apart, we're in the Second War, because this time is going by extraordinarily fast. I knew we needed hours for this, but we now, just because of the clock, need to get to that Second War, which is the focus here. And I think I'd like to examine it in part by calling out three names. Abraham, John Caesar, and John Cavallo, who was better known as Gopher John. These are Africans.
Who goes on to become even more known as John Horse.
That's right. So if you could kind of, through their eyes, take the audience now into this war. What was at risk, why they were fighting, and what the results were.
Okay. So by the time we get to the 1830s, Andrew Jackson is in office. Things have just deteriorated to the point where they are fighting now.
Yeah.
You have three major bands. There's what we call the St. John's Band, which is the St. John's River, which is on the East Coast. And the main city on the St. John's River is Jacksonville. Most people think Jacksonville is on the coast. It's actually on the river. And so that's one band.
Right.
The second band is what we call the Gainesville Band, which is Gainesville, north central Florida. It's a little closer to Jacksonville, but we consider it, well, a little closer, but it's on your way between Tallahassee and Jacksonville. So, and that's basically north central Florida again. And then you have your third band, which is in the Tampa area. When they get pushed down Angola, that's the Tampa Bay area. So you got your three bands. All right. Each one of those men you named represented each one of the bands in the area.
Yes.
John Caesar was the oldest because he came out of the oldest area, which was St. John's. Because of course when the initial enslaved people began to run away and abscond, they came straight down the coast,
Right.
straight into St. Augustine.
Right.
So they stayed around the St. Johns River.
Right.
All right. John Caesar was he was an older gentleman. We figure him, we have no pictures of him or anything, but we figure him to be early 50s at best, mid 50s, early 60s. His job was recruitment.
Yeah.
He was the best recruiter. He would go on doing what we call plantation raids.
Yes.
He would raid the plantation for supplies, guns, horses, cattle, all that good stuff, but then he would convince others to run away.
Again, because of the clock,
Speed it up.
Let me tell you something. We got 4 minutes left.
Oh, well, I can do it.
Only 4 minutes left.
I can do
so
it.
I need you to.
I wish you would have given me the 5-minute notice. I would have run it then.
Okay.
But very quickly, Caesar dies.
John Caesar, yes.
Because he's doing these plantation raids in 35. It's his plantation raids that get the war going, right? So Caesar dies. He's older. Like I said, he was going back and forth. His wife was still on the plantation, so we ascertained that she was probably a cook or something at high visible. That's why she could never run away. And then in the Gainesville band, we have what we call our primary Black Seminole chief, and that was Abraham.
Right.
And he was the visor or the chief.
This is Abraham. This is Abraham right here. Y'all need to know about Abraham.
He's the chief Black Seminole, especially after Caesar dies in 35. He takes over. He's the negotiator. He speaks because Micanopy doesn't speak English well.
Chief
so
Micanopy, right.
Chief Micanopy doesn't speak English well. So he's the main person negotiating with the government and with the United States. And then there's a third band, and that's Go for John, or John Horse.
Right.
He's a lot younger. He's in his 20s.
Right.
But he is the son of a Seminole Native American chief.
Right.
But because his mother is black, he's still considered a Black Seminole. He doesn't belong to a band.
Right.
I mean, he doesn't belong to one of their bands. All right. So what happens is Abraham is the leader in Florida during the war. But John, because John Horse is a lot younger, he's also who his right hand is, places him in a higher category. He's Osceola's visor. He's Osceola's right hand. And I think, and I want to say this quickly, I think Osceola doesn't get the recognition that Geronimo, Sitting Bull, and Chief Joseph gets is because of who he was. He had a Black Seminole wife. Most of the people in his band, his war band, were Black Seminoles.
So in these last 90 seconds, I'd like for you to share, again, what was you characterized this as the most successful slave rebellion.
Yes.
Talk about what was at stake and what was accomplished.
Okay. What was at stake, of course, was re-enslavement and enslavement for some, because we're talking 2 and 3 generations now. We're talking people who had never known slavery now, just their grandfather. And so that is, of course, the most important thing, right? But it was also the growth of plantation society itself. We can trace, and I'll say it very quickly, each Seminole War opened up Florida and Plantation Society, or Florida Society, period, by the time we get to the third. First Seminole War, 2 years after the first Seminole War ends, Florida becomes a territory. Then we had a second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842. 3 years later, after the second Seminole War, after they decide that, okay, the blacks can go out west, we won't re-enslave you, which gives them the victory, why I say it's a successful rebellion, Florida becomes a state. Florida becomes the 45th state. And then the third Seminole War, they wanted to open up South Florida. They were even crazy enough to think that they could drain Lake Okeechobee just to flush them out. And so they went into a third war that ended in 1858. That war ended because they felt like the Seminole numbers were low enough that they didn't have to worry about them impeding progress. So they were willing and able and ready to go into South Florida, But of course, this ends in 58. They leave the Union. They go into and by 1861, they end war.
And for those who were genocide was being practiced against,
Yes.
they had to make the decision: stay here and fight, and know that we're going to be slaughtered, or agree to move on.
Right.
And they moved on and they lived.
And that's what kind of changed Abraham's leadership,
Yes.
right? Because he has to negotiate.
Yes.
And of
Yeah.
course, they don't, when
Yeah.
you negotiate, some people not going to be happy.
Mm-hmm.
But the best thing was to negotiate that move to the Arkansas Territory, present day Oklahoma.
Yeah. 'Cause
That was the best. That was the best choice, and most of them got on.
Yeah.
The one got on board with it,
Yeah.
such that, and this is important. By 1838, most Black Seminoles were out.
Yeah.
And
after kicking a
out
whole lot
west.
of U.S. military butt, they got to live another day
They got to live with freedom.
with freedom. Thank you so much for coming, Dr. Dixon.
Thank you. You got to
Folks.
bring me back. We got to talk more.
Yes, more. Yes, we got to talk more. Thank you for joining us this evening. For more information about this program or any other program produced by WHUT, go to WHUT.org. Goodbye, and may God bless, and may you stay free.
This program was produced by WHUT, Howard University Television, and made possible by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.